The ship called the Resolute groaned like an old beast as it slid into the docking clamps of Station Velora. And the man sitting in the pilot's seat let out a breath he had been holding for 3 hours straight. Commander Elias Vance was not a commander anymore, not really, but the title had stuck to him like a scar that refused to fade. And he wore it the same way he wore everything else, with quiet stubbornness and a refusal to explain himself to anyone. He stood from the chair and stretched his back until something popped, then grabbed his long weathered coat from the hook near the door and pulled it over his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight settle against his body like an old friend saying hello after a long time apart. The coat was brown and beaten and full of patches where energy bolts had burned through the fabric over the years, and underneath it he wore simple dark clothes that had seen better days, and on his feet were reinforced military boots that could crack stone if he kicked hard enough. But the thing that drew the most attention was not the coat or the boots. It was the sword. Strapped to his right thigh in a worn leather sheath was a longsword made of carbon steel, forged on Earth over 100 years ago by his grandfather's hands in a workshop that smelled of coal and iron and sweat. And Elias had carried it across 14 star systems without ever once considering leaving it behind. He stepped off the Resolute and into the massive promenade of Station Velora, and the noise hit him like a wall. The station was enormous, a spinning ring of metal and glass floating in the deep black between two dead stars, and it served as one of the galaxy's largest trading hubs, where species from dozens of worlds came together to buy and sell and argue, and sometimes kill each other when the arguing stopped working. Elias walked through the crowd and felt the stares immediately. A group of Korvathi, tall, crystalline beings, whose bodies reflected light like living diamonds, watched him pass with expressions that could only be described as mild disgust, the way someone might look at a stray animal that wandered into a fine restaurant. 2 Dralith merchants, insectoid creatures with 4 arms and clicking mandibles, paused their negotiations to glance at him, and then returned to their work as if he was not worth the lost seconds. Humans were new to the galactic stage, and no one was impressed. They called humanity a Class 7 developing species, which was a polite way of saying that the galaxy considered them barely more interesting than clever animals who had accidentally figured out how to build starships. Elias did not care about any of that. He had a contract to pick up, supplies to buy, and a drink to find, and he intended to do all 3 before the station's cycle shifted to night mode. He was halfway across the promenade when he felt someone watching him, not with the casual dismissal of the Korvathi or the brief curiosity of the Dralith, but with something deeper, something that felt like a beam of light focused directly on the back of his skull. He turned and saw her. She was Silvani, but never seen one in person, and now he understood why every spacer who had met one talked about them for weeks afterward. She was tall, almost his height, with skin the color of a summer sky just before dusk, a deep soft blue that seemed to glow faintly from within, as if her blood was made of starlight, and her eyes were large and luminous, shifting between silver and violet like moons reflecting off still water. Her hair was white as fresh snow and floated around her shoulders, as if gravity was only a suggestion she occasionally chose to follow, and she wore a fitted suit of pale fabric covered in tiny symbols that Elias guessed were academic markings of some kind. Beautiful in the way that a nebula is beautiful, vast and strange and slightly terrifying, and she was walking straight toward him. Elias stopped and waited, because running from a curious alien on a crowded station never ended well. And he had learned a long time ago that the best way to deal with the unknown was to stand still and let it come to you. She stopped 2 feet in front of him and tilted her head to one side like a bird examining something shiny, and her glowing eyes traveled slowly down from his face to his chest to his waist, and then locked onto the sword strapped to his thigh. Her lips parted. "Human," she said, in broken galactic common, her voice carrying the musical vibration that all Sylvani voices seem to have. "Is that a sword between your legs?" The promenade noise seemed to dip for just a moment, as if the universe itself wanted to hear his answer. Elias blinked once, then twice, and then for the first time in longer than he could remember, he actually didn't know what to say. Could remember. He laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a small laugh, but a real honest sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest, and it surprised him almost as much as it surprised her, because he had not made that sound since before the war, since before the things that had turned his hair gray at the temples, and put lines around his eyes that had no business being there on a man of 38. "Yes," he said when the laughter faded to a grin. "Yes, it is." Her eyes went wide, wider than they already were, which was saying something, and she leaned forward with the energy of someone who had just discovered something extraordinary. "May I see it?" Elias looked around the promenade, noted the security cameras and the various aliens going about their business, and thought about it for exactly 1 second, before he reached down and drew the blade. The sound it made leaving the sheath was a whisper of steel against leather, a sound that had not been heard on this station in all of its 200 years of existence, and the effect was immediate. The nearest Korvathi flinched backwards so hard that their crystalline body chimed like a struck bell. A Draelith merchant dropped a datapad and scrambled behind their stall. 3 station security officers reached for their plasma sidearms. But the Sylvani girl did not step back. She stepped closer. Her glowing eyes reflected the blade's surface as she stared at it, with an expression that mixed wonder and confusion and something that might have been hunger for knowledge so intense it bordered on obsession. "It is beautiful," she whispered, "and terrible." "It is both," Elias agreed, and he meant it. Before either of them could say another word, the station's lights turned red, and a deep alarm began to pulse through the walls like a heartbeat gone wrong, and a voice thundered over the intercom in 6 languages at once. "Residents and visitors, the Gren Syndicate has established a blockade around Station Velora. All departure lanes are closed. This is not a drill." The promenade erupted into chaos around them, aliens shouting and running and pushing toward shelters. But Elias and the Sylvani girl stood still in the middle of it all, the sword gleaming between them like a promise. She looked at the blade, then at him, and said, "I am Liara Velthine, and I think I need to understand what you are." Elias sheathed the sword, and met her glowing eyes with his own steady gray ones. "Stick with me," he said, "and you will." The emergency council chamber was a wide circular room near the top of the station, where representatives from every major species sat in tiered seats that rose toward the ceiling like the inside of a bowl turned upside down, and it smelled like fear, even though most of the species in the room did not sweat the way humans did. Elias stood at the back of the chamber with his arms crossed and his shoulder leaning against the cold metal wall, because nobody had invited him and nobody wanted him there. But nobody had the courage to tell a man with a sword on his leg to leave. Liara sat beside him on a supply crate she had dragged from the hallway, her long legs crossed and a small datapad resting on her knee, where she was taking notes with the frantic energy of someone who had found the subject of a lifetime. The council was arguing, and it was not going well. Ambassador Krelvorin of the Korvathi stood at the center podium, his crystalline body pulsing with agitated light, as he spoke in a voice that sounded like glass scraping against glass. "The Gren Syndicate has deployed 10 blockade vessels in a spherical formation around the station," he said, "and they have issued a single demand: full surrender of the station's cargo reserves, all fuel stocks, and 12,000 units of refined plasma core material. A Draelith trade minister clicked her mandibles in outrage and stood on 4 legs. "That is everything," she hissed. "They want everything we have, and if we give it to them, we will starve before the next supply convoy arrives in 40 days. "And if we fight," Krilvorin replied, "we will die today instead of in 40 days, which is hardly an improvement." The room erupted into overlapping voices, each species talking over the others in their own language, until the translators could not keep up, and the noise became a soup of alien fury and helplessness. Elias listened and watched and said nothing, leaned toward him, and spoke in a low voice that hummed against his ear. "Why do you not speak?" she asked. "You have been listening for 30 minutes, and your face has changed 4 times, which I have learned means you are thinking very hard." "I am counting," Elias said. "Counting what?" "Problems," he said, "and so far I count one big one that nobody in this room has figured out yet." "Tell me." Elias looked at her, and something in his gray eyes shifted, the way the sky shifts when a storm decides to stop threatening and start arriving. "The Gren have adaptive shielding," he said. "New technology, probably stolen from the Korvathi research labs, based on how nervous the ambassador looks every time someone mentions it, and that shielding absorbs and redistributes directed energy." "Yes," Liara said. "That is why the station's plasma turrets are considered ineffective against them." "Right," Elias said. "Plasma is energy, laser is energy, Yan is energy, pulse cannons are energy, and every single weapon on this station, and every single weapon carried by every single security officer on every single deck, is some form of directed energy." Liara's luminous eyes widened as she understood. "They cannot hurt the Gren," she whispered. "Not with anything they have," Elias confirmed, "but I can." He tapped the hilt of his sword, and Liara looked down at it, and then back up at his face, with an expression that was halfway between amazement and the certainty that he had lost his mind. "That is a piece of metal," she said carefully. "That is the point," he said. "Their shields are designed to stop energy, not mass, not a physical object moving through space with nothing but momentum and a sharp edge, because nobody in this galaxy has used a physical weapon in so long that the concept does not even exist in their defensive calculations." Liara stared at him for a long, silent moment, and then she asked the question that had been building inside her since the moment she first saw him on the promenade. "Elias, what are humans?" He turned to face her fully, and his voice dropped to something quiet and serious and ancient. "We are the species that never stopped fighting," he said. "Every other civilization in this galaxy reached a point where they evolved past physical violence, where they developed technology that made the body irrelevant, where they forgot what it felt like to hold a weapon in their hands and feel the weight of it, and know that survival depended on the strength of their arms and the speed of their feet." He paused and looked at his own scarred hands. "Humans never did that," he continued. "We built starships, and we still box. We developed artificial intelligence, and we still wrestle. We cracked faster than light travel, and we still forge swords, and train with them every single day, because somewhere deep in our bones, we understand. Something that the rest of the galaxy forgot," Liara asked, and her voice was barely a breath. "That the universe does not care about your technology," Elias said. "It only cares whether you are willing to stand up and fight when everything else fails." Liara looked at him, and for the first time she did not see a primitive creature from a backwater planet. She saw something old and dangerous and beautiful in the way that a storm is beautiful. Something that had been shaped by 1,000,000 years of blood and fire and refusal to die. A massive explosion rocked the station, and the lights flickered, and the alarm changed from a steady pulse to a rapid shriek that meant only one thing. "Breach!" a security officer shouted into his communicator. "We have a breach on Deck 14. Gurren boarding party. 8 hostiles. Security teams engaging." The council chamber erupted into panic, but Elias was already moving toward the door with long, steady strides. that ate up the distance, like a predator who had just heard prey. Liara jumped off the crate and ran after him. "Where are you going?" she called. "Deck 14, he said without looking back. "The security teams are already there with plasma rifles." "And those plasma rifles will do nothing against adaptive shields," Elias said, and he drew his sword as he walked, and the steel sang as it cleared the sheath. A sound so out of place on a space station that it seemed to bend reality around it. "You are going to fight 8 Gren raiders alone with a sword," Liara said, and it was not a question. "I have fought worse with less," Elias replied. "That is insane. That is human." They reached the access corridor to Deck 14, and Elias stopped at the security door and turned to face Liara one last time, and his expression was calm, in a way that frightened her more than the alarm or the explosions or the thought of the Gren. Was the calm of someone who had made peace with what was about to happen a very long time ago. "Stay here," he said. "No," she said, and her jaw was set, and her glowing eyes burned with something fierce. He studied her face for one heartbeat, and then he did something that surprised them both. He smiled. "Then stay behind me," he said, "and watch closely, because what you are about to see is going to change everything you think you know about the galaxy." He turned and opened the door, and the sounds of plasma fire and screaming poured through the gap like water through a broken dam, and Elias Vance walked into it, with nothing but 3 pounds of carbon steel and 10,000 years of human stubbornness. Liara followed him into the fire, and her datapad was forgotten, and her academic distance was gone, and in its place was something raw and new and terrifying. She was about to see what a human could do when the universe tried to kill him. The universe was about to learn that it should have tried harder. The corridor of Deck 14 was a mess of smoke and sparks and the sharp burning smell of plasma bolts hitting metal walls, and through the haze, Elias could see exactly what he expected to see. Station security officers crouched behind barriers, firing plasma rifles at the Gren raiders, and accomplishing absolutely nothing. The Gren stood in the middle of the corridor like statues carved from dark stone, 8 of them in heavy combat armor that was covered in a thin shimmering layer of blue light, and every plasma bolt that hit them was swallowed by that light and turned into nothing, absorbed and scattered like rain hitting a lake. The lead Gren was enormous, nearly 7 feet tall with thick gray skin and 4 eyes that glowed a sickly yellow, and he was laughing in a deep rumbling voice that shook the floor plates as his squad advanced step by slow step toward the security line. "Keep firing," the Gren leader bellowed in accented galactic common. "Light tickles and my soldiers enjoy the warmth." The security officers were terrified, and Elias could see it in the way their hands shook and their shots went wide, and their eyes kept darting toward the exits behind them, calculating how fast they could run. Elias did not run. He walked forward past the security line and into the open space between the defenders and the Gren, and the security officers stopped firing because they could not believe what they were seeing, and the Gren stopped advancing because they could not either. The lead Gren tilted his massive head, and all 4 of his yellow eyes focused on Elias, with the confused amusement of someone watching an insect do something unexpected. "What is this?" the Gren said. "Human," one of the other raiders muttered, checking a scanner on his wrist. "Class 7 species. No threat classification. Planet of origin is called Earth. Notable for nothing." Laughter. "A Class 7 walks into a war zone carrying a stick," he said. "Is this a joke your species tells?" Elias said nothing, and instead shifted his weight onto his back foot, and brought the sword up to a middle guard position with the blade angled slightly forward, and his left hand open at his side, for balance, and his breathing slowed, and his eyes went flat and empty, in the way that eyes only go when the person behind them has turned off every part of their brain that is not dedicated to violence. The Gren leader stopped laughing. Something in the human's posture had changed the air in the corridor, the way a drop in pressure changes the air before a hurricane. And even though the Gren had never seen a human fight, even though they had no frame of reference for what they were looking at, some ancient instinct, buried deep in their predator brains, whispered a single word: danger. "Kill him," the lead Gren said, and his voice was no longer amused. Two raiders raised their plasma rifles and fired. Elias moved. He did not dodge the way the aliens expected, with a leap or a roll or some dramatic acrobatic display. He simply was not where the bolts arrived, shifting 2 inches to the left and dipping his head 3 inches lower, in movements so small and so fast that to the Gurren it looked like the shots had passed through him. And then he was among them. The first raider did not even see the blade coming, because Elias closed the distance in 3 steps that covered the space faster than the Gurren's 4 eyes could track, and the sword came up in a rising arc that caught the raider's adaptive shield at the wrist joint where the armor met the gauntlet. The shield flared blue and bright, and then the blade passed through it like it was not there. Because it was not there. Not for this. Not for a physical edge moving through space, with mass and momentum and the full focus strength of a human arm behind it. The raider's weapon arm separated from his body at the elbow, and he screamed a sound that Elias had heard before, in different voices, on different worlds, and it all sounded the same in the end. The second raider swung a heavy fist at Elias's head, and Elias ducked under it, and drove the pommel of the sword into the raider's throat, and then reversed the blade, and cut deep across the gap between chestplate and hip armor. The third raider tried to grab him from behind, and Elias stepped sideways, and let the raider's momentum carry him forward, and then brought the sword down in a chopping strike that found the thin point between helmet and neck guard. 3 Gren down in 4 seconds. The remaining 5 raiders backed up for the first time in their lives, and the fear on their faces was new to them, and they did not know what to do with it, because they had never needed to know. Elias advanced. He did not scream or roar or make threats. Humans who truly know how to fight do not waste breath on performance. And his silence was worse than any war cry, because it meant that this was not emotion driving him. It was something colder and more precise. It was skill refined by a species that had 10,000 years of practice at ending things. The fourth raider raised his rifle like a club, because shooting was pointless, and Elias cut the rifle in half, and then cut the raider down with the return stroke. The fifth and sixth came at him together, and Elias fought them both at once, with movements that flowed like water, if water could kill. The blade dancing from target to target, in patterns that no alien combat computer could predict, because they were not based on algorithms. They were based on instinct and muscle memory, and the terrible creative genius that humans bring to the art of destruction. Both raiders fell. The seventh turned and ran. The eighth, the leader, stood alone in the corridor, surrounded by his fallen soldiers, and stared at the human with all 4 eyes wide, and his mouth hanging open, and his adaptive shield flickering uselessly around his body, like a candle trying to protect against a flood. "What are you?" he whispered. Elias stepped forward and placed the tip of his sword against the spot where the Gren's armor was thinnest, right below the chin, and the leader felt the cold bite of steel against his skin for the first time in his life. "I am a human," Elias said, "and this is a sword, and your shields were never built to stop either of us." The Gren leader dropped to his knees, and the fight was over. Behind Elias, the security officers stood in stunned silence, their plasma rifles hanging at their sides, their mouths open, their minds trying to process what they had just witnessed. A single human with a metal blade had done in 30 seconds what their entire squad with advanced directed energy weapons could not do at all. Stood at the back of the corridor, with her hands pressed against her mouth, and her luminous eyes so wide that they looked like twin moons. And the datapad she had been carrying was on the floor where she had dropped it, because her hands had gone numb and her brain had gone quiet, and every single assumption she had ever made about the universe had just been cut in half, along with the Gren raiding party. Within 10 minutes, the security footage was everywhere. Every screen on every deck of Station Velora played the clip on repeat, and aliens who had never heard of Earth watched a single human carve through 8 shielded Gren raiders with a weapon that most of them could not even name. And the station went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the blockade, and everything to do with the sudden realization that they had been sharing the galaxy with something they did not understand. The Korvathi ambassador watched the footage 3 times, and then turned to his aide, and said in a voice that trembled like cracking ice, "They kept their claws. They never evolved past it. They kept their claws." Liara found Elias sitting on the floor of the corridor afterward, his back against the wall, and his sword across his knees, and a cloth in his hand that he was using to clean the blade with slow, careful strokes. And there was no pride on his face, and no satisfaction, just the tired calm of someone who had done a hard thing, and was now doing the small things that came after. She sat down beside him, and said nothing for a long time. Then she reached out and touched the flat of the blade with one blue finger, and the edge caught her skin, and a thin line of glowing silver blood appeared on her fingertip, and she stared at it with wonder. "I have studied 47 species," she said quietly, "and none of them are like you." "No," Elias agreed, "they are not. I want to understand," she said, "not as a researcher, not for my paper. I want to understand, because I think the galaxy needs to know what you are, before it is too late." Elias looked at her, and saw that she meant it, and something in his chest that had been locked shut for a very long time opened just a crack. Before he could answer, every speaker on the station crackled to life, and a new voice filled the air, deep and cold, and carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who enjoyed causing pain. "This is War Commander Drexus of the Gren Syndicate," the voice said. "Your little display was entertaining, but the 8 soldiers you defeated were a scouting party, nothing more. The real assault force is 10 warships carrying 12,000 combat troops, and they will arrive at your station in 6 hours." The message ended, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Elias had ever heard. He looked at Liara. She looked at him. 6 hours, she said. 6 hours, he repeated, and then he stood and sheathed his sword and held out his hand to help her up. "Then we had better get to work." The emergency council reconvened within 20 minutes of War Commander Drexus's transmission, and this time every seat was full, and this time every eye in the room turned to look at the human standing at the back wall when he walked in. Elias did not wait for an invitation to speak. He walked down the center aisle between the tiered seats and stepped onto the speaker's platform at the center of the chamber, and stood there with his coat hanging from his broad shoulders, and his sword at his thigh, and his gray eyes sweeping the room the way a lighthouse sweeps the sea. "You have 6 hours," he said, and his voice carried through the chamber without amplification, because he had spent years giving orders on battlefields where being heard was the difference between life and death. 6 hours before 12,000 Gren soldiers breach this station and take everything you have, and probably kill most of you in the process. The room was silent. "Weapons are useless against their adaptive shields," Elias continued. "Your energy barriers will slow them down, but will not stop them. And your security force of 300 officers was not trained for the kind of fight that is coming, because the kind of fight that is coming has not happened in this part of the galaxy for 10,000 years. Ambassador Krelvorin stood, and his crystalline body flickered with anxious light. "Then what do you propose, human?" he asked. And for the first time, there was no contempt in the word human, only desperation. "I propose that we do what my people have always done when our backs are against the wall," Elias said. "We forge weapons, and we fight." He reached behind his back and pulled out a datapad that he had been working on during the walk to the council chamber, and he projected its contents onto the main screen above the podium. It showed schematics, simple ones, clean lines and basic shapes that any industrial fabricator could produce in minutes, for swords and spears and shields and pikes and armor plates, all made from carbon steel alloy using raw materials that were already sitting in the station's cargo holds. The Gren's adaptive shielding neutralizes directed energy, Elias said, but it was never designed to stop physical impact, mass, sharp edges, brute force, because nobody in this galaxy uses those things anymore. Nobody except humans. He pointed to the fabricator bay locations on the station map. Velora has 14 industrial fabricators designed for hull repair and component manufacturing, he said. If we repurpose all 14 and run them at maximum output for the next 5 hours, we can produce approximately 4,000 steel weapons and 2,000 sets of basic plate armor. The room erupted. "This is madness," a Korvathi delegate shouted. "You want us to fight with primitive tools like animals?" "I want you to live," Elias said. His voice cut through the noise, like his sword cut through shields. "You can argue about dignity when you are not dead." The Dralith trade minister rose on her 4 legs and clicked her mandibles thoughtfully. "The human defeated 8 Gren alone with this method," she said. "Our combined security footage confirms it, every second of it. The adaptive shields could not stop his blade." 1 human against 8 is not the same as a station of civilians against 12,000. Krelvoran argued. "No," Elias agreed, "which is why I am not going to fight alone. I am going to teach every volunteer on this station how to hold a weapon and how to use it, and how to stand their ground when everything inside them is screaming to run." Liara stood from her seat in the observation gallery above the chamber, and her voice rang out clear and strong and surprised even herself. "The Silvani will volunteer," she said. "All of us. Our psionic abilities allow us to share awareness across groups," she continued. "If we join the defense, we can coordinate the fighters, share tactical information in real time, warn of flanking movements, and amplify the courage of those around us." She paused and looked directly at Elias. "He showed me what 1 human can do," she said. "I want to show him what we can do together." The chamber was quiet for 3 long heartbeats, and then the Dralith trade minister clicked her mandibles and stood tall. "The Dralith will volunteer," she said. "We have 4 arms each, and I suspect that makes us very good at holding spears." A rumble of agreement spread through the Dralith delegation, and Elias felt something shift in the room, something that tasted like hope mixed with fear, which in his experience was the exact recipe for bravery. Even some of the Korvathi stepped forward, young ones mostly, whose crystalline bodies had not yet hardened into the rigid shapes of their elders, and they volunteered with trembling voices, but steady eyes. Within the hour, the fabricators were running. Elias stood in the main fabrication bay and watched molten steel pour into molds for the first time in the history of Station Velora. And the orange glow reflected off his face and made the scars on his hands look like rivers of fire. And beside him, Liara watched with an expression that was equal parts horror and awe. "Your species invented this," she said, staring at the liquid metal. "We perfected it," Elias said. "Steel is the backbone of human civilization. We built our cities with it, and we conquered our world with it. And when we reached the stars, we brought it with us, because some things you do not leave behind." The first blade came out of the mold, still glowing, and Elias picked it up with a gloved hand and tested its weight and its balance, and nodded once. "Good enough to kill with," he said. "Not pretty, but it does not need to be pretty." The training began immediately in the station's largest cargo hold, which had been cleared of containers and turned into a makeshift training ground. And Elias stood at the front of 400 volunteers from 7 different species and felt the weight of what he was about to do settle onto his shoulders like a mountain. These were not soldiers. They were merchants and scientists and engineers and artists and students, and most of them had never held a weapon of any kind in their lives. And their hands shook, and their stances were wrong, and their eyes were full of the kind of fear that comes from suddenly understanding that the universe is much more dangerous than you thought. Elias began with the basics. A sword is not complicated, he told them. You hold this end, and you put the other end into your enemy. And everything between those two actions is just practice. He showed them grips and guards and footwork. Everything down into movements so simple that even a Korvathi, whose crystal fingers had never wrapped around a hilt, could follow along. The Drelith were naturals with spears, their forearms giving them incredible reach and the ability to block and strike simultaneously. And Elias watched them drill, and allowed himself one small moment of professional admiration. The Silvani struggled with the physical aspects, but their psionic abilities changed everything, because when one of them learned a technique, they could share the feeling of it across their entire group in seconds, spreading muscle memory like a signal through a network. And within an hour, they moved with a coordination that would have taken human soldiers weeks to develop. Liara trained beside Elias personally. She was terrible at first, her swings too wide, and her stance too narrow, and her grip so tight that her blue knuckles turned pale. But she refused to stop, even when her arms burned and her hands blistered and silver blood seeped through the wrappings on her palms. "Why do you keep going?" Elias asked her, during a break, as he wrapped fresh bandages around her hands, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence he had demonstrated hours before. "Because you told the council that the key to survival is the willingness to stand up and fight," she said, "and I believed you." He looked at her, and in that moment something passed between them that was not romance and was not friendship, but was something older and rarer, the recognition of one soul by another across an impossible distance. "You are going to be terrible with that sword," he said. "I know," she said. "But you are going to be brave with it," he said, "and sometimes that matters more." The hours burned away like fuel in an engine, and when the 5th hour ended, the cargo hold was full of armed aliens, who were not soldiers, but who had chosen to fight anyway. Fabricators had produced 3,800 blades, and 2,000 sets of armor, and 1,200 spears, and 600 shields, and the station smelled of hot metal, and sweat, and determination. Elias stood on a raised platform and looked out at the army he had built in 5 hours from nothing, and he did not give a long speech, because long speeches are for people who have time. "The Gran are coming," he said. "They expect to find a station full of helpless civilians with useless energy weapons. They do not expect to find steel. They do not expect to find you standing in their way, with blades in your hands and fire in your hearts." He drew his grandfather's sword and held it high, and the orange light of the fabricators caught the blade and made it burn like a star. "They wanted a station," he said. "Let us give them a war." The cargo hold roared with voices from 7 species, united by steel and terror and the desperate courage that comes from having absolutely no other option. And then the alarms screamed, and the lights went red, and the first Gren warship dropped out of hyperspace, like a predator falling from the sky. Liara stood beside Elias, with a short sword in her trembling hands, and her glowing eyes burning with a light that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice. "I am afraid," she said. "Good," Elias said. "Fear means you understand what is happening. What you do next is what matters." "What do I do next?" "You fight anyway." The station shook as the first breaching pods hit the hull, and the war for Vylora began. The breaching pods hit the station like fists slamming into a table, each impact shaking the walls and sending vibrations through the floor that Elias felt in his teeth. And within 60 seconds, the first Gren soldiers came pouring through the ruptured hulls in every section of the station, expecting to find screaming civilians and empty corridors. They found steel instead. On Deck 9, a line of Drelith defenders stood four abreast in the narrow corridor, with spears leveled and all four arms braced. And when the first wave of Gren charged through the breach, with their adaptive shields glowing bright blue and their confidence radiating off them like heat, the Drelith thrust forward as one. The spears went through the shields like they were made of air. The Gren stumbled and fell and screamed, and the ones behind them tried to push forward, but the corridor was narrow, and the Drelith were fast, with their forearms cycling between spears, and the rhythm of it was brutal and efficient, and the Gren could not break through. On Deck 12, a unit of young Korvathi volunteers held a junction point with heavy shields fabricated from doubled steel plate, their crystalline bodies ringing like bells every time a Gren fist or weapon struck the barrier. And behind them, a row of Sylvani fighters coordinated the defense with psionic links that let every defender know exactly where every attacker was at every moment. It was not perfect, and it was not clean. The aliens were not soldiers, and their training had lasted 5 hours, and it showed in the ragged formations and the dropped weapons, and the moments of panic when someone broke and ran. But for every one who ran, there were 3 who stayed and held the line, because a human had looked them in the eyes and told them that courage was a choice, and they had chosen. Elias fought at the central hub, where the heaviest assault came. The Gren had concentrated their best troops at the station's core, because that was where the main power systems and life support and command center were located. And they sent 200 soldiers through 4 breaching points simultaneously, expecting to overwhelm whatever pitiful defense waited for them. What waited for them was Elias Vance and 40 volunteers, and a forest of steel. Elias moved through the Gren ranks like a river through rocks, flowing around strikes and cutting through gaps, and never stopping, because a human body in full combat motion is a terrifying thing to face for any species, and the Gren had never faced anything like it. His sword sang with every swing, a high clear note that cut through the noise of battle like a voice calling out in a storm. And every note meant another Gren shield split open and another raider fell. And the volunteers behind him followed in his wake with spears and swords and the desperate energy of people fighting for their lives. The Sylvani psionics made the element difference between chaos and coordination. Liara stood behind the front line with 6 other Sylvani, their eyes closed and their hands raised, and their minds linked in a web of shared awareness that covered the entire station like a net of light. And through that web, every defender could feel where the Gren were pushing and where they were pulling back, and where the line was weak and needed help. She fed information directly into Elias's mind in pulses of pure intuition. Enemy left, gap right, 3 coming low, big one behind the pillar, and he moved with it like a dancer following music. And the combination of human combat instinct and Sylvani psionic awareness created something that neither species could have achieved alone. It was beautiful and terrible, and it was winning. But the Gren kept coming. For every raider that fell, 2 more climbed through the breaches, and the defenders were getting tired, because fighting with steel weapons demands everything from the body, in a way that firing a plasma rifle does not. And muscles burned, and hands cramped, and the adrenaline that had carried them through the first 30 minutes began to fade into exhaustion. Elias felt it too. His arms were heavy, and his breath was ragged, and there was blood on his coat that was partly his and partly not, and a deep cut on his left forearm was bleeding freely because a Gren blade had found a gap in his guard during a moment when 3 of them came at him at once. He blocked a strike and countered and put another Gren down, and then turned to find 4 more rushing toward him from the side corridor, and he raised his sword to meet them. He did not see the one behind him. A Gren raider had circled around through a maintenance shaft and came up behind Elias with a heavy combat axe raised overhead, and the blade was already falling toward the back of his skull when Liara screamed. Not out loud, but through the psionic link. scream that was pure desperate refusal to let this happen. And the force of it hit the Gren Raider like a wall of invisible pressure, and knocked his arm sideways so the axe missed Elias's head by inches and buried itself in the floor plate. Elias spun, and Liara was there, already moving, her short sword in both hands, and her luminous eyes wide with terror and fury. And she drove the blade forward into the gap between the Raider's chest plate and shoulder guard, with every ounce of strength her Sylvani body possessed. The Raider fell, and Liara stood over him, shaking so badly that the sword rattled against the armor, and her silver blood dripped from the blisters on her palms, and she looked like she was going to collapse. Elias caught her by the shoulders and steadied her, and his voice was rough but warm. "You did good," he said. "That fear you feel right now means you are alive." "I killed someone," she whispered. "You saved someone," he said. "Hold on to it." That, instead. She nodded and gripped her sword tighter, and stood back up, and the shaking did not stop. But she did not fall. The battle raged for another hour, and the station ran red with grain blood and silver Sylvani blood, and the strange luminous fluid that passed for blood in Dralith veins. And the corridors that had been clean and bright were now scarred and dented, and full of the sounds that all battlefields share, regardless of what century or what planet they happen on. And then War Commander Drexus came. He came through the central breach personally because his soldiers had failed, and his pride demanded that he finish this himself. And he was massive, nearly 8 feet tall in his custom battle armor that was layered with triple-thickness adaptive shielding that glowed so bright it hurt to look at. And in each of his 4 hands he carried a weapon, 2 plasma axes and 2 heavy combat blades. The remaining defenders fell back, because the sheer presence of him was enough to push them away, and his triple shields deflected every spear and sword that came near him, the physical weapons bouncing off the layered energy like sticks hitting a boulder. Elias stepped forward alone. The central hub was nearly empty now, just scattered debris and fallen fighters, and the 2 of them standing 10 meters apart. And the lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that jumped and danced like frightened animals. "You are the human," Drexus said, and his voice was like grinding stone. "I am," Elias said. "You have cost me soldiers and pride and time," Drexus said, "and I am going to break you apart with my hands and hang your primitive weapon on my wall as a trophy." Elias studied the triple-layered shield, and his mind worked the way it always worked in moments like this. Not with panic, but with cold, clear analysis, measuring the rhythm of the shield layers as they cycled and pulsed and overlapped. The gap that every system has, because nothing in the universe is perfect. He found it. The triple shield cycled in a rotating pattern, and there was a moment, less than half a second, where all 3 layers aligned, and left a thin corridor of unshielded space directly at the center of the chest. Half a second. Elias shifted the sword in his hand and gripped it by the blade near the guard, the way European knights used to grip their weapons when they needed to throw with precision, a technique called a murder stroke that was older than gunpowder. Drexus charged. Elias waited, counted the shield cycles in his head. 1, 2, 3. Watched the layers rotate. 4, 5. And on the 6th cycle, when the gap opened like a door swinging wide for just a heartbeat, he threw the sword. It left his hand with every ounce of force his human body could produce, every muscle from his toes to his fingertips contributing to a single explosive release of energy. That was not directed, and was not technological, and was nothing but mass and velocity and the savage precision of a species that had been throwing weapons since before they could speak. The sword flew straight and true through the gap in the triple shield, and buried itself to the hilt in War Commander Drexus's chest. The massive Gren staggered, and looked down at the steel protruding from his armor, with all 4 of his yellow eyes wide with shock. And his mouth opened, but no words came out. And he fell forward like a mountain collapsing, and the impact shook the floor, and the silence that followed was enormous. The remaining Gren soldiers across the station heard the death of their war commander through their communication links, and the fight went out of them like air from a punctured hull, and they retreated, pulling back to their breaching pods and scrambling for their ships. The Gren fleet broke formation and ran. Station Velora stood battered and bleeding and scarred but standing, and the defenders who had held the line, with nothing but forged steel and borrowed courage, stood in the corridors and looked at each other with the dazed wonder of people who cannot quite believe they are still alive. Elias pulled his sword from the body of War Commander Drexus and cleaned the blade one more time and sheathed it. The footage spread across the galaxy within hours. Every species on every world with access to a communication network watched the Battle of Velora, watched a single human teach an entire station to fight with metal weapons, watched aliens who had never held a blade stand against an army and win, and the galaxy shifted on its axis in a way that had nothing to do with physics. The Galactic Species Index was updated the following day. Humanity's classification was changed from Class 7 Developing Species to a new designation that had never been used before. Apex Persistent Predator. Threat Classification. Extreme. Do not engage in close quarters under any circumstances. Liara published her research paper 6 weeks later, and it became the most widely read academic document in the history of the Galactic Research Consortium, translated into 114 languages, and its title was simple and devastating. They never stopped being dangerous. On the night the paper was published, Liara sat beside Elias on the observation deck of Station Velora, which had been repaired but still bore the scars of battle, in the scratches on the walls and the dents in the floor that nobody wanted to fix because they had become something sacred. The stars burned outside the window in colors that had no names in any language, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that only exists between two people who have been through something together that words cannot reach. Liara rested her head on his shoulder, a human gesture she had learned from watching him and practiced in private until it felt natural, and the warmth of him against her blue skin was strange and wonderful, and felt like the answer to a question she had not known she was asking. "I asked you about the sword," she said quietly. "I did not know the answer would change everything." Elias smiled and rested his hand on the hilt of his grandfather's blade and looked out at the stars with eyes that were tired and peaceful and full of something that might have been hope. "It is not the sword," he said. "It never was." "Then what is it?" He looked at her, and his gray eyes met her luminous silver ones, and the space between their worlds collapsed into something warm and small and infinite. "It is the hand that holds it," he said. And outside the window the stars burned on as they always had, indifferent to the wars and the victories and the small moments of connection that made it all worth fighting for. But inside the station, human and an alien sat together in the quiet and watched the universe, and for once the universe watched back and thought to itself that perhaps it should be more careful about the things it underestimates. Because the humans were here now, and they had brought their swords.